In this tutorial, I'm going to walk through the steps that you need to take in order to upgrade from the Vue CLI version 2 to 3. And then I'm also going to talk about some of the key differences. So right now I am on the Vue CLI GitHub page, and it actually has the commands that you need in order to run the installation process. Now, I'm assuming if you're watching this video that you want to upgrade from 2 to 3, but I'm still going to show you exactly how to do that. So right now in Visual Studio Code, I'm going to press Command or Control tilde, and that is going to open up the terminal. And then from there, let me also just increase the size of the font just so it's a little bit easier to see. And I'll stretch this up. And the way that you can tell which version you're on, you can type Vue dash and then a capital V, and that's going to tell you the version of the Vue CLI that you're working with. Now, do not let this confuse you. This may look like you're working with the Vue the framework and that you're working with version 3, but that's not the case. You're actually just working with the CLI version. And I know that can be a little bit confusing, but at the end of the day, the command line interface is all that you have access to. Anytime that you're typing Vue here in the terminal, that means you're interacting with the Vue CLI. So I already have this on my system because I've been building out a few test applications. But if yours says something like 2.9 or anything like that, then that means that you may want to install version 3. Now the way you can do that is if you use npm, then you can use this command here. And if you're using yarn, then you can use this command. I'm going to copy this because it doesn't hurt to type this command in, and it will simply see if there are any updates or anything like that. And so I'm going to press enter, and this is going to go through the entire process. Now I know I already have the very latest version, so right now it's just checking through the metadata. It's making sure there aren't any other key updates that it needs to perform. But I'm going to fast forward through this process. Oh, and it's actually already done just because I truly do have the latest version, which at the time of recording is Vue CLI version 3-beta 11. Now I will say that if it says anything, so when we run the Vue create command that we're going to run here in a second, if you do that and it says, hey, there is a later version and that it recommends that you upgrade to it, I definitely recommend that you run this command again. And the reason for that is because I ran into an issue a couple days ago where I had a slightly older version, and I mean a couple days older version, and when I tried to run a command, it actually broke. So if it recommends during the beta process that you upgrade, then I would say you might want to upgrade. So the way that you generate an application, I'm going to walk through two ways to do this. The first way is by just typing Vue create, and actually let me change into the desktop just so I can show you both of these right next to each other. So I'm going to say cd /desktop, and now I can say Vue create and then my basic version 3 app. Now, this is a very different way of doing this than you may be used to. So if you are used to version 2, then you would type Vue init webpack and then my version 2 app, something like this. Well, in version 3, they went with this different syntax. And the reason for it is because they realized that pretty much everybody was already using Webpack. So they decided to just include it by default. And so now all you have to do is say Vue create and then whatever the name of your application is, you can type enter, and this is going to give you a different set of questions. So we'll walk through this, and this is the reason why I'm going to create 2 Vue apps. The first one's going to be the default. So if you just press enter, this is going to go and it's going to start generating the new default version of Vue. And I'm going to just fast forward through this part because this can take a while. If this starts to take longer than you're used to for Vue version 2, do not worry. It takes much longer on my system as well. So I'm going to fast forward this and we'll come back when it's done. Okay, it looks like that finished and it worked. So I'm going to perform those instructions, exactly what we have right here. So I'm going to change into this directory and then I'll say npm run serve. Now this is different also than version 2. In version 2, we'd say npm run dev, but I'm going to show you where you can find the list of commands to run, and serve is the version 3 naming that they went with. So this is going to go build out the entire system, and so now it looks like all of that worked, and we can go to localhost 8080. So let's open up the browser just to make sure that this is working and all of that's working properly. So let's come back here. I'm going to stop the server by pressing Control-C, and let's open up the file system here. So I'm going to click on Open Folder, click to the desktop because that's where I have it saved. And now you're going to see a few different types of commands and also a very different file structure. So in version 3, the Vue CLI team really simplified the entire system. So now you may notice one of the key differences, and I opened up a old version 2 directory that I have here. This is the Vue API app that we built out if you followed along in any of my other courses. You may have noticed this is a very different file structure. Here you had a Babel file, you had a editor config, you had getignore, you had post css.rc.js, you had readme, index, and then your package JSON files. Those are all pretty standard, and even though we're missing a few of those, you can still add them and work with them if you need to. The biggest difference is the config directory. The config directory here had a dev, an index, and then a production file. Now you may notice you do not have a config directory in version 3. And this goes and speaks directly to the fact that Webpack is no longer something that gets added, and instead it gets added by default and it's wrapped up. So you don't see any dependencies here in your package JSON file for Webpack. But if you look at your package lock, Webpack actually is included, but the Vue CLI wraps it up. So if you just search and look for Webpack, you'll see that it's actually referenced 65 times in this file. So you are using Webpack even if you don't quite realize it, because version 3 just includes it by default and it wraps it up. It also, the goal of this is really, it's trying to simplify the entire process. Webpack can be quite confusing if you're not familiar with using it. So what the CLI team tried to do is try to make that process a little more streamlined. So now that you have all that, and you also can see right here that it's working, very similar to how version 2 worked. Let's stop this. So I'm going to close out of all of it and we are going to open up the CLI. Let's change back into the desktop, and now let's create a different project, and we'll create a custom one because, as you may have noticed, the questions that the CLI asked you were very different than in version 2. So now if I say Vue create, I'll say custom Vue 3 app, just like this, and instead of going through the old process, and also instead of just picking the default options, and it looks like there's a little issue. Let's see what it says. Just a timeout error. If you ever get any of those, just run the same command right again, and that really usually just depends on your internet connection. So it worked this time. It was able to communicate with the server, and so instead of picking default, I'm going to now say I want to manually select my features. So you can use the arrow keys on your keyboard to switch between these two. You gotta press enter, And now you can see that you have all kinds of different options. So we have the ability to pick Babel, to work with TypeScript, to have a progressive web app as default, to use the Vue router, to use Vuex for our data store, to have preprocessors such as Sass or less, to have a linter, to have unit testing, and to use end-to-end testing. So this is pretty cool. So before, the way that the Vue CLI worked in version 2 is it went through a series of questions. But in 3, what it did is it just took all of those questions and it said, you know what, you can pick on an a la carte basis what you want included. So I'm going to pick what I want. I do want Babel. I don't want TypeScript. I don't want a progressive web app. I do want the router. So I'm using the arrow keys to go up and down. If I want something, I press the space bar. So I press space and it says, okay, router's been added. Go down again. I do want Vuex. I do want a CSS preprocessor. I do not want a linter. So I now have the exact application template that I want to work with. And now after you're done, just press the enter key. And then it's going to ask the type of CSS preprocessor that you want. So you could pick Sass, you could pick less, or stylus. I'm going to pick Sass. Press enter now. And then it's going to say, where do you prefer placing config for Babel, PostCSS, ESLint, etc. And I'm just going to say, just put that in the package JSON. You could also have them in dedicated config files, but I'm going to say in package JSON. And then it asks, do you want to save this as a preset for future projects? So that's pretty cool. This would actually save to your local system. If you build out these type of applications with those settings quite often, then you could do it. I'm not going to do it because I like picking them out on a case-by-case basis. So I'm going to say capital N, and that's it. And now it's going to go through and it's going to install that entire system. So I'll fast forward through this part, and when it's done, I'll start it up and I'll show you some of the differences in the architecture it creates for us. Okay, it looked like all of those commands work. So now we can change into our custom Vue 3 app. And then let's actually open this up before we even run it. So I'm going to go up here to open folder, and then we can click on custom Vue 3 app. And then this is going to open up the code base that was created. Now you can see that everything is pretty similar. One of the key differences here is this Babel config file. And then if you click on the package JSON, this includes things like our post CSS adapter. So this is where we can have any plugins and anything like that. So that's where it's a little bit different. Now I'm going to open up the terminal here, and let's just make sure everything's working. So I can say npm run, and then if you remember back to version 3, you're probably used to typing npm run dev all the time. But the way that you can tell the difference is simply come into your package JSON file and then come down to scripts. So by default, you have 2 options. You have serve and then you have build. So if you want to work with this locally, just type npm run serve, and then this is going to generate the bundle, or it's not going to generate the bundle file. That's what build does. It's just going to generate everything you need in order to get working. If you come here and now refresh, you can see this shows that we're working with our custom Vue 3 app right here, and everything's working. If you want to test it out, you can click on SRC and then go into components, hello world Vue here, and let's just type in ASDF at the very beginning of it just to make sure it's all working. Switch it up, and now you can see everything is working. There are definitely some key differences between 2 and 3, and I'm going to be publishing all of my new courses for Vue are going to be using version 3 of the CLI, and I'm going to make a very I think a very helpful video in showing you how you can deploy a version 3 app directly to Heroku and some of the key differences you're going to have to make and some of the file changes you have to make. But some of the different things that you want to take a look at that are different is now you have this public directory here. This is different. You used to have static, so now it's public, but you still just have a index HTML file in your favicon. You have your node modules, and then you have way fewer auto-generated files here at the root of the project. And then one key difference, or I should say a couple of key differences. Now instead of a router directory, now you just have router.js. And as you can see, this is all identical to what you had. It just gave you now a home and a about. And so that gives you just a little bit more guidance on how to build your routes out. Because we chose Vue X, this gives us a store.js. So this is how you can work with a data store in Vue. And then also now you have this just views directory. So this is definitely different than version 2. So this gives you your about view, which is just a template by itself, and then your home view, which is a template, and then a basic component. So those are just a few key differences. So if you went through that, you now know how to upgrade from Vue CLI 2 to 3, along with having a solid idea on what the key differences are on what gets generated for you between the versions.